All right, well, maybe we'll get started. Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this, the first of two educator workshops. This one will be on navigating difficult histories and difficult knowledge in education, and we're thrilled to have everybody with us tonight. Just a couple of things as we get started here. So I will be sharing slides. There are a few of us who are co-hosting tonight. So Joe Eggers, Demetrios Vital. Demetrios will introduce himself and I'll introduce myself in just a moment as well. But feel free to reach out in the chat to any of us with any issues. The slides, I put a link to the slides and to the CEU certificate in the chat. It should be the first thing in the chat. So if you open up the chat and you scroll up to the top, I'll also put that link in, those links in again towards the end of the workshop tonight. If you want to pin one of a video so you can see a video in addition to the slides, you can also do that as well. And so I guess with that, maybe we'll get started here. So just to run through a schedule of what we hope will happen tonight, and we'd like to keep this very casual and make it more conversation-like, which I know is something that can be very difficult to do in a Zoom meeting like this. And so hopefully there will be an opportunity to turn our cameras on and microphones on and have a little bit of a discussion at different points tonight. So just going through the schedule, we'd like to welcome everybody. We'd then like to offer a land acknowledgement and then some introductions. And then I'd like to share a poem and talk a little bit about how I've used poetry in my own classroom and my own practice. And then offer a little bit of space for an opening reflection around defining what is difficult in our contexts. And then jump into just a brief discussion of some frameworks around difficult teaching and learning. And then hopefully we can turn our cameras on and have more of a discussion around difficult histories and difficult knowledge, two of these frameworks, and then have a broader discussion. And then just we'll conclude with some thoughts about next steps. So this workshop is being hosted by the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, an institution which we acknowledge occupies the ancestral and current homeland of the Dakota Nation and peoples. And we further acknowledge that this land was stolen from the Dakota and continues to be occupied illegally. We acknowledge that the land was ceded during the negotiations for the 1837 Treaty of St. Peter's and the 1851 Treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. These treaties were subsequently abrogated by the United States government following the US Dakota War and the forced expulsion of the Dakota from the state of Minnesota. We acknowledge that the actions of the US government and the state of Minnesota before, during, and after the US Dakota War constitute genocide, and that they are part of the larger genocide of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. We recognize, support, and advocate for the Indigenous peoples and nations of Minnesota and those Indigenous peoples living in Minnesota today and across the United States and the Americas. And it's our hope that by offering this land acknowledgement, we can affirm Indigenous sovereignty and humanity, and that we will continue to work to hold the University of Minnesota accountable for the continued erasure of Indigenous peoples, histories, cultures, and contemporary realities from this land. If you'd like to think more about land acknowledgements in your own context, I would encourage you to go to the link at the top and native-land.ca, which has an interactive world map of Indigenous land, and then also hundreds of pages of materials for K-12 teachers and other community organizations to think about how to craft land acknowledgements, or indeed have your students have a hand in crafting one for your classroom. And then I'll also just mention at this point, in late August, The Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies is hosting a public talk on the current state of Indigenous representation, so how Indigenous peoples are represented in K-12 education and museum spaces in both Minnesota and Manitoba. So it's a comparative, it'll be a comparative look at Indigenous representation across both contexts, Minnesota and Manitoba, with a speaker from each offering some of their thoughts from their work. And so it should be a fascinating conversation. And if you're interested, you can find more information, including the link to register at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies website. So with that, I just would like to introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name is George Dalbo, and I am the Educational Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'm also a current PhD student here at the University of Minnesota, and I'm in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction studying social studies education. And I'm particularly interested in how difficult histories, difficult knowledge, genocide, the Holocaust, human rights, mass violence, mass atrocity are talked about in K-12 spaces, in curricula and classrooms. And before coming to the University of Minnesota, I was a social studies teacher, both middle and high school, in the Twin Cities for about a decade. And so I'll try to bring some conversation of things that I've done in my own classroom into tonight's discussion. So glad to have everybody here and looking forward to the discussion. I guess I'll turn it over to Demetrios.
Thanks, George. I appreciate, I'm really honored to be able to be here with you all. I work for the IDEAL Center of the Science Museum of Minnesota. Our group, IDEAL stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Access, and Leadership. And the IDEAL Center is the Science Museum's professional development wing, and we are our professional development team, and we are focused on equity and disrupting systems of oppression, and both fostering the understandings and the skills that allow people to do that in their workplaces and in their lives and communities. And before working at the Science Museum, I worked for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And before that was when I was an undergrad, took classes from the founding director. So I have a long history of my life being really deeply informed by the work of CHGS. And my father is a Holocaust survivor, so this work and the way our work and our understandings motivate us to act in the world is deeply critical to how I understand how we have to be. So I'm really, again, honored to be able to be here with you all.
Perfect. So, So I'd like to start by sharing a poem. This is something that I have done in my classes, both at the University of Minnesota and then also high school and middle school social studies classes. And, you know, I often refer to this in my work with educators and students as Poetry Friday, which is part of a larger movement of poets who, you know, got into the habit and the practice of sharing a poem every Friday. And so it was something that I took up in my own classroom, and not that I always did it on a Friday, but often I did on Fridays. And so I thought it would be a nice way for us to kind of enter this space, this virtual space tonight, would be to share a poem. So I'll read the poem aloud, which is something I often do in class. And the poem it's from a poet and an author, an activist named Deborah Miranda, who is herself Indigenous and writing from California, her experiences growing up in California, and often writes about schools and schooling. And the poem is Lies My Ancestors Told For Me. And so this is Lies My Ancestors Told For Me. Riddle, when is a lie the truth? When is the truth a lie? When a lie saves your life, that's truth. When a lie saves the lives of your children, grandchildren, and 5 generations forward, that's truth in a form so pure it can't be anything but a story. After the mission broke up, it was better to lie, like a dog, about blood. Say you are Mexican, Mexican, Mexican. Put it on the birth certificates. Tell it to the census takers. Tell it to the self-appointed bounty hunters who appear at your door looking for Indians, Indians, Indians. And when you tell that lie, tell it in Spanish. Give your children Spanish names: Tranquilino, Maria Ignacia, Dolores, Faustino. Lies that deflect genocide. So tell them loudly at the baptismal font in the old mission, to the Indian agent collecting bodies for the boarding school at Riverside. Broadcast the names in the street like wheat when you call your Mexican children in at dusk for a bite of acorn mush and cactus apple. Grandmothers dress like a poor white woman, in other words, like a Mexican. Wear their heavy aprons, high-necked muslin dresses, and shoes, 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 shoes. Shame your grandchildren when they run around barefoot. What are you, an Indian? And stand silent, approving when digger becomes their favorite slur to hurl at the youngest, the awkward, the slow, the dark. Don't tell them you still speak Chumash with their mother. That's a lie your descendants will hate you for, but lie anyway, so they'll be alive to complain. Grandfathers, lie about where you're going when you slip out at night, retrieve your dancing clothes from the hiding place, drive up unlit roads to a ranchera in the hills where clappers and rattles whisper the truth and bare Indian feet beat against the earth, beat, 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 like children begging to be let back inside. Don't teach old songs to your grandchildren. Don't make the regalia in front of them. Don't dance where young eyes might see. Sing the alabada when the priests can hear. Hum the deer song when they can't. Drag your feet in the dust. Buy a tie for Sundays. Tell the lies now, and maybe later your descendants will dig for the truth in libraries, field notes, museums, wax cylinder recordings, newspaper reports of massacres and relocations, clues you left behind when you forgot to lie, 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 lie. I'll say sharing poetry has been one of the joys of my teaching career, and it doesn't take very long into the school year until students are coming with their own poems to read aloud in front of the class. And indeed, you know, I'm teaching a course right now at the University of Minnesota, and it's already started to happen where students have come with their own poems. So to start digging in a little deeper into difficult knowledge, difficult histories, and talking about the difficult in education, we thought we would just pause and allow people the space for a brief self-reflection. And so I've got 2 prompts, and would love for people just to consider these. Write if you want. Feel free to share something in the chat if that's comfortable for you, but don't feel compelled to do so. And so the questions I have are: what do difficult histories and difficult knowledge mean for you in your context recognizing that perhaps with us tonight, we're not all K-12 educators. And so just thinking about difficult histories and difficult knowledges without even talking about them in more detail, how they kind of hit you just hearing these terms and what you're thinking of in terms of your own practice and context. And then I think the second question is, how have you navigated? And I think by navigated, you know, I push people to think about both engaged and avoided the difficult in your context. So, you know, what is this difficult? And then how have you engaged with this or avoided this in your own context? And so maybe we'll give people just 3 or 4 minutes time just to kind of reflect, and then we'll come back together. Okay, maybe finish up your thoughts. And we'll pull people back together in just a few seconds. Okay. So I'd like to, before we jump into a discussion or a couple of discussions, I'd like to just have us think about some of these frameworks that exist, coming largely, so my background's in social studies, and I'll apologize that a lot of this is taken from the literature from the field of social studies education, but I think it's applicable across multiple disciplines, multiple areas. And I thought it would be helpful just to look at some of the various frameworks, albeit briefly, that scholars have taken up and theorized around difficult knowledge, difficult histories in the context of education. And so an early framework is something that Hunt and Metcalf have termed closed areas. And they write that these closed areas are certain areas of conflicting belief and behavior that are largely closed to thought. And at the time, 1968, and even a little earlier, Hunt and Metcalf are largely talking about things like race, things like sexuality that are fairly taboo within society and therefore are also taboo or closed in their terms within education as well. And building on this work of closed areas from Hunt and Metcalf, many theorists, and so I just list a few here who have pulled together a recent chapter, have taken up this notion of controversial issues. And controversial issues, very similarly, talks about things that are closed in education. And often controversial issues are framed as things that are inappropriate or would be seen as inappropriate or objectionable by parents, administrators, or the larger public. And I often think what's missing here are teachers themselves, that teachers might find these things to be controversial and therefore, wouldn't engage with them in a classroom discourse or classroom discussion, or would engage with them in a way that, they may not engage with things that they understand as not controversial or less controversial. But I think a lot of the research and researchers have started to think about controversial issues also as a set of pedagogies. And so the second part of this quote, a variety of pedagogical strategies designed to help students investigate, evaluate, or deliberate issues that have multiple and competing views. And so this idea that it's not just the things that are controversial, it's not just that content, but it's also the way that teachers would navigate through that controversy. So those pedagogical strategies, and I imagine avoidance, right, might be one way that we could think of teachers navigating through some of these controversial issues. But many theorists have started, many researchers have started to think about the different strategies that teachers are using to engage students in researching, and analyzing, investigating, discussing these issues. Other researchers, including Pat Avery, who is a retired professor here from the University of Minnesota, have written about taboo topics. And so building again on this idea of controversial issues or closed areas. And they write that taboo topics are those that social studies teachers, and indeed other teachers as well, may choose to avoid or de-emphasize because of their perceptions or beliefs regarding the sensitivity of the topic. And so I think this is what I was suggesting was missing perhaps from controversial issues, that, the teacher as gatekeeper has a real role in deciding what is taught in a classroom and how it's going to be taken up. So what issues are brought into discussion and what issues are not allowed into a classroom. And often, of course, societal taboos would govern those things. Next, we could look at a framework, difficult histories, again, which multiple scholars have taken up in different ways, but Epstein and Peck write, the type of violence dominant groups enact on marginalized ones, any period of violence or bloodshed that causes emotional pain or trauma can be a difficult history. And so a broad definition, right, of any kind of painful or traumatic episode within society could be deemed a difficult history. Teaching tolerance, and I mentioned this just because it's often in my email inbox, right, that I have an email from Teaching Tolerance, and I think it makes its way around many schools, and into the hands of teachers, right, is a framework that they refer to as hard history, which I think is, coming directly from the work on difficult histories. And really, they're pointing to slavery, the history and legacies of slavery in the United States. And so they write that most students leave high school without an adequate understanding of the role that slavery played in the development of the United States, or how its legacy still influences society and us today. And they've developed all sorts of lesson plans and indeed a very robust framework to help teachers and students engage with difficult conversations around the hard history of slavery in the United States. And then lastly, just to mention difficult knowledge, which is a term coined by Deborah Britzman and has been taken up in various fields in education. And Pitt and Britzman write that difficult knowledge is the representation of social trauma and the individual's encounter with it in pedagogy. And so this idea that, there are these difficult histories perhaps, and if we think about how individual teachers and students engage with these, encounter these difficult histories within a classroom or elsewhere, we might refer to this as difficult knowledge. And so of all of these frameworks, I think one thing that I really wish I had done more of as a teacher was explore frameworks like this. Often these frameworks are termed theoretical frameworks. And it wasn't until I got into grad school that, people would push me to think about in my research, what is the theoretical framework that is guiding your research? And, in reflecting back on my years as a classroom teacher, I've often thought, certainly theory guides what I was doing in terms of developing curriculum and lesson plans and interacting with students in my classroom. But often I didn't think about how that theory was guiding and what those theories were that were guiding the work that I was doing and with students. And I think if I had been a little more purposeful in thinking about these theories and how they were shaping the way that I was working with students and taking up certain issues within my classroom, I could have been much more purposeful in my practice. And so tonight we were hoping to have a little bit of a discussion around two of these, difficult knowledge and difficult histories. And so we've pulled together essentially a prompt. It's what is your reaction and responses to the following quotes. And so the two quotes, one from Epstein and Peck that I shared on the earlier slide, and then another one from Pitt and Britzman, which is slightly different around difficult knowledge. So they write, difficult knowledge is what one makes from the ruins of one's lovely knowledge, which is a quote that I often wake up in the morning and have this rattling around in my head, wondering, what exactly this means. And so we And so one of the things that this was from several years ago, teaching a middle school class. And so it was younger students, they were in 8th grade, so older middle school, but younger students overall. And I was teaching a global studies course, and I noticed that we had it was a textbook series, and often I would, look at the textbook and what was represented there, and we would use that as a starting point and often critique the narrative and build on the narrative. And we were just starting to turn our attention to talk about the Koreas, and I noticed that there was a paragraph about the so-called comfort women system. So women who were forced into, often we use euphemisms like comfort women or, forced prostitution and things like that, right? But forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese, in the years before and then during World War II. And taken from the greater Japanese empire from places like Korea. And there was a paragraph in the textbook, and this was a textbook that was ultimately meant for high school students. And the paragraph was so vague, and it was written in such a way that I think, many of my 8th grade students, they would have read the paragraph and come away from reading this with no idea that, that the comfort women were forced into, prostitution, forced prostitution or sexualized slavery. And so thinking about how to address that in my class and wanting to talk about this system, but also wanting to be aware, that students may not have had, a lot of experience talking about sexualized violence and rape and even within the context of war, but also recognizing that often in my class, we would talk quite openly about violence, but rarely was it violence of a sexualized nature. And again, I'm still, I think, wrestling with how to approach such topics and thinking about how I, did this in my class and the results of it. But I'll share. So I used this image, which is an image from a statue that's often referred to as the Statue of Peace. And this version, there are versions around the world now, including in the United States, one in Glendale, California, but this is in Seoul, South Korea, facing the Japanese embassy. And so I initiated a discussion having students, after we talked a little bit about what the Comfort Women system was, showed this image of the memorial and had students talk about, what they were seeing in the memorial. And so rather than recreate that here, I'll just point out the bird that's sitting on the shoulder of the young woman, and perhaps the expression on her face, or the way that her hands are clasped in her lap, what she's wearing, including on her feet, right, which you can't see because of the flowers. And so students, kind of just going back and forth asking, what do you see in the photograph? What do you notice, or, in this monument, in this memorial rather, and students, of course, pointing out the empty chair. And we would dig deeper and deeper, and more students would add on, to their classmates and suggest, what the meaning of the empty chair would be, or the bird on the shoulder, or, what's being conveyed in the expression on her face. And, finally getting to this notion that perhaps, often we talk about the survivors of the Comfort Women system, but not those who died. And so this empty chair, right? But, many other meanings for the empty chair as well. And so we had this discussion, and, when things got a little too uncomfortable, perhaps for, it became palpable in the class that there was this discomfort around, getting closer and closer to voicing the idea of rape and sexualized violence, we could pull back and look at the statue again and, ask, well, what do you think about the bird on her shoulder? What might that mean? And then, we could march forward and get closer and closer again. And it was interesting for me, going through this as a teacher, and then having, as we were kind of wrapping up the day's lesson, and, students were getting ready to move on to whatever their next class would be. One of the students in the class, a young female student, raised her hand and shared with the entire class an experience where she had been, catcalled on the street, and felt unsafe and sexualized in a way, and then following her saying this, another student immediately followed with another experience and another experience, until many of the students, especially the female students, had gone around the room and shared these very similar experiences of feeling unsafe. And even one student shared how she had felt unsafe in the school hallways, where someone had touched her, an older student had touched her inappropriately in the hallway. And it was an interesting experience for me, thinking about how those experiences had never been voiced in my classroom before. And though I thought I had a classroom that was open to, students discussing things, it was, there hadn't been that space before. And so in many ways, talking through, a difficult history or difficult knowledge around rape and sexualized violence and opening up that space had allowed for that to happen. But of course, recognizing too and following this up with students, and perhaps I wish I had done more, or been able to do more at the time, but how, a lesson like this, does come with the ruins perhaps of one's lovely knowledge, to quote Pitt and Britzman. And, but then thinking about myself in this situation and how uncomfortable I was as someone who's never experienced sexualized violence, and, recognizing, that discomfort and trying to push through that, where it would have been so much easier as a teacher to avoid that. And, thinking about this textbook passage where you could read it and come away with, really no understanding that the comfort women, were raped repeatedly. And so this textbook, wasn't confronting, I wasn't confronting, my students wouldn't have confronted their lovely knowledge. And I think also, there are many, I'll just point out there are many resources out there that would highlight the different aspects of this memorial. But I also think it's important to talk about, how these women, the survivors, right, have found voice and agency after the fact, and, organized protest to push for recognition of what happened to them and the other comfort women from, the Japanese and even within Korean society. And to make sure that that story is also shared with students as well. And so I think at this point, we wanted to open it back up for a little bit of discussion. We recognize our time is running short at this point, but allow people just to kind of talk for maybe 10 minutes or so before we wrap things up. And I appreciate Demetrios leading us through the discussion earlier, and maybe we would make this a little less formal and just people that are interested in sharing. I've pulled together 3 questions. So one is, how do your identities as a teacher, and perhaps not all of us are teachers, but in the work that we do, right, how do our identities impact what is framed as difficult in our work and how we approach such topics? And I think certainly reflecting on my own experience of not approaching, for instance, rape and sexualized violence, because of my own identity, perhaps. But then the second question, how do students' identities or perceptions of student identities? I think often teachers, we think we know our students, but may not know that much in reality about them. How do students' identities influence how you conceive of and approach difficult knowledge in your work? And then what are some institutional and social barriers that you and your students have to navigate or have been perhaps unsuccessful in navigating? So maybe I'll, and I really appreciate the conversation tonight. So we're just thinking of ending tonight with just a brief self-reflection, so kind of coming full circle to where we started, and just having people think about coming out of this evening's conversation, as brief as it feels, but what are some of the commitments that you're going to make moving forward regarding your own praxis? And then also just to share my email address and Demetrios as well. And, we're happy to chat with people via email at any point moving forward.